Great. Okay. It's really great to be here. I want to give a particular warm thanks to the Daynards for making this fellowship possible, and I've been having the most wonderful time for the past day and a half. I can't believe we're only halfway through. I've seen so many of your faces come by, 34 Cargill is it, and stop in and tell me about what you're doing and what your futures hold and what your interest is and the overlap between what you're planning and restorative justice, and also people who know less about restorative justice who are excited about it. So it's been a really wonderful few days being with faculty and students and administrators. I was thrilled to receive Dean Spieler's invitation to come be a part of this program. Your law school has an unparalleled reputation for its simultaneous dedication to intellectual vibrancy and social justice and public interest. So the idea of showcasing restorative justice in this context really just makes both my heart and my mind sing, and my microphone apparently too. So we have about an hour and a half, hour and 15 minutes left together, and I'm going to talk for just about an hour and then leave the rest for question and answer. So I talk really fast, and I apologize, and I have a lot of material that I want to cover because there's so many applications of restorative justice, and I know there's so many varied interests in this audience. So let's see. So the hour is going to look a little bit like this, just to give you a sense. We'll start with some restorative justice theory, and then talk a little bit about restorative practices and what those look like on the ground in action in Oakland and elsewhere. We'll talk a little bit about restorative justice's effectiveness in relationship to our present systems of criminal justice and school discipline. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about, finally, the title of this talk, which is Restorative Lawyering as Liberatory Practice, and what it might mean to incorporate restorative justice into legal education. And then we'll wrap up with some restorative justice resources, and what, for those of you who are interested in seeing how you might want to learn more about restorative justice, particularly practically, how you can pick up some skills in restorative justice, I'll give you some information about that at the very end. So, restorative justice is, if nothing else, a paradigm shift in the way we think about wrongdoing. And I like to start with this quote by Albert Einstein, who says, if you want to solve a problem, you can't continue to think the way you were thinking when you created it. And I think we really need to own, for starters, that we created our criminal justice system. We created our school-to-prison pipeline. And in part because we're a democracy, and in part because it was a lot of our lofty ideas that gave rise to many of the terrible decisions that then created things like mass incarceration and a wildly unaffordable system, particularly in the criminal justice system, that does this amazing job of disproportionately locking up our brown and black youth and our adults, and that's actually really, really ineffective given our recidivism rates as compared to other methods of dealing with wrongdoing. So we've got a big problem, and we created it, and we need to change the way in which we were thinking when we created it. So how were we thinking when we created it? Well, let's start with a little bit more about what is restorative justice anyway. Maybe it would be helpful to some of you who don't know too much about restorative justice. Can I ask how many of you have actually participated in active restorative justice programs? So, oh, quite a few. And how many have read something about restorative justice? Wow, this is great. And how many of you hearing about restorative justice basically for the first time today? Like nobody. Okay, that's amazing. So some of this will go a little faster through the front slides then, which is restorative justice is a theory of justice which emphasizes repairing harm, invites affected parties to collaboratively determine how to repair that harm, and gives equal attention to victims' needs, accountability, community safety, and enhancing people's capacity to become more productive, positive members of their community. So that's just sort of the background on restorative theory. And in thinking about how we were thinking when we created the system that we currently created, there's sort of the three questions that many of you must know since you've all read or heard about restorative justice in some way. Howard Zare came up with these questions. He's sort of considered the grandfather of contemporary restorative justice. He wrote a text called Changing Lenses in the 80s, which sort of brought restorative justice sort of into print, or the Western implementation of restorative justice into print. It's a great book. I would strongly suggest reading it. And he posed these three questions of how do we think about wrongdoing today? We ask, what law was broken? Who broke it? and how do we punish them, basically, is the way in which definitely our criminal justice system thinks today, and many of our school discipline processes think this way too. Restorative justice asks a completely different set of questions. This is the basic paradigm shift. It asks what harm was caused and to whom, what needs have arisen based on that harm, and whose obligation is it to meet these needs. And restorative justice also in its paradigm shift looks at these things very broadly. So the basic definition of restorative justice that most people adopt is Howard's, which is, it's a process to involve, to the extent possible, those who have a stake in a specific offense and to collectively identify and address harms, needs, and obligations in order to heal and put things as right as possible. So harms, needs, and obligations are basically the three terms that you hear over and over again in thinking about restorative justice. So the big picture principles is that crime is a violation of people and interpersonal relationships, notably not necessarily, or at least not primarily, the state, right? It's a violation of people and interpersonal relationships. Those violations create obligations, and the central obligation is, as much as possible, to do right by the people that you've harmed. That's restorative justice in a nutshell. I'll tell you a little bit about the origins of restorative justice in North America. In its present operating form. Two Canadian youth in 1974 got in a mess of trouble in a small town that didn't see a whole lot of trouble. They did serious damage to 22 properties, and the town was pretty rocked by this. And Mark Yancey was a probation officer at the time. He was really tired of the revolving door of the juvenile justice world. He'd seen some of these kids before. And the larger group of kids that were involved in this mess. And he basically came up with the idea, and he put it in the pre-sentence report to the judge, that these children should be made to go door to door and apologize directly to the 22 families who they'd done harm to. So ill-conceived and maybe not the safest approach to bringing victims and offenders together, but this was Mark's idea. So the judge loved it. He said, yes, I'm sentencing these young people to have to go door to door and apologize to the 22 families that they did damage to, or whose homes they did damage to. So 28 years later, Russ Kelly, who had been one of these kids, and he had had a really heartbreaking life. He was widowed. He was orphaned when he was very young, one parent, and then a few years later, the next parent, and his older brother was doing his best he could to raise him, and there were questions about in and out of state assisted care for him, and got in a lot of trouble with drugs, et cetera, when he was sort of at his absolute low point when he did these 22 property damaging events. So he's finally turned his life around. 28 years later, he's in college, and he hears there's a class that's covering restorative justice, and he hears this story, and it's about him. And he's completely mortified. So it always reminds me when I'm doing these talks to not give too many identifying details about any of the cases that I'm talking about, in case any of you out there were some people that I worked with a few years ago. But anyway, Russ now volunteers with Mark Yancey. He's like, that's my probation officer, and I have to go. After he got over his mortification, he sought out Mark Yancey and said, how can I help? And now he's a central piece in what's the Community Justice Initiatives, which was it was basically the first large-scale restorative justice program in North America. So let's talk a little bit about the spiritual and cultural roots of restorative justice. If we look far enough back in any one of our cultures, restorative justice finds its roots there. In that the idea of the collective resolution of conflict exists in all of our societies and all of our cultures. But I'll showcase sort of three that I really like, which is in the Truth, TRC stands for Truth and Reconciliation Commission, really popularized this word Ubuntu, which many of you may have heard. But I'm not going to butcher this, but Ubuntu, Ngumuntu, Ngambantu means a person is a person through other persons. And I think this expression really expresses the depth of what restorative justice is really about. Next, Native American peacemaking circles, First Nations people use these peacemaking circles, which at their base say there is no out. There is nowhere out that we can continue to send people. We can't send them away and out. This is the circle, and we're bringing everyone into this circle to resolve our conflict. And finally, my personal area of interest, which is the Tibetan system of justice prior to Chinese occupation, pre-59, the entire legal system was predicated on this notion of interdependence, and that we are all absolutely connected in every way. Again, there is no out. There is nowhere to send people away to fix the problem when they can come back when they're better. We have to figure out how to do it here. And this quote summarizes it best. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. It's Dr. King. So let's talk a little bit about what restorative justice is and then a little bit about what it isn't. Howard Zehr talks about a continuum of restorative practices that range from the pseudo or non-restorative all the way over to the fully restorative. And there are many different types of restorative practices that fall along this continuum. And there are these 6 sort of signposts, little markers that you can look for in your restorative justice program or in the restorative justice program that you're going to create someday. And when you do that, think about these 6 questions and make sure that you're answering as many of these, honestly answering these as many of these as in the affirmative as you can. And the first is, does the model address harms, needs, and causes? Causes, we usually talk about harms, needs, and obligations, but I think a really effective restorative justice program looks at causes as well. And what that means is, what are the roots of the offending? And are we doing something to address it directly? Are we doing something to root out the roots of offending? Next, is it adequately victim-oriented? And that doesn't necessarily just mean a surrogate victim or we allow a victim to speak, but that victim's voice doesn't actually have any impact on the process. Those things aren't necessarily victim-oriented or aren't sufficiently victim-oriented, or maybe they're a little bit more victim-oriented than not including the victim at all, but is it really victim-oriented when we think about orienting ourselves in the place of what the harm has been to the victim of the situation? I think we need to be very critical about this question when we're thinking about true restorative justice programming. Next, are those who harmed encouraged to take responsibility, not forced, not coerced, but encouraged to take responsibility? Are all relevant stakeholders involved? And again, I would ask that we think broadly about relevant stakeholders when there is a rape of when a woman's raped who jogs around this lake at 7:30 in the morning or 6 o'clock in the morning every day, all the other women who jog at that time who heard about it may stop jogging around that lake, right? They are stakeholders in this harm. Is there an opportunity for dialogue and participatory decision-making? This is my favorite one. This is the one that I really try to keep at the center of the restorative processes that I involve myself in, because I think that in many ways, many of the other things can flow from this one if we allow dialogue and participatory decision-making by the affected stakeholders. It tends to be a more restorative process. And then, is the model respectful to all parties? And again, we should check ourselves very carefully about what we mean by respectful. So these are some of my favorite restorative practices, which are conferencing models. There are so many different types of things that people call restorative. I've even heard that there's some Supermax facility that's a restorative justice Supermax. I'm not feeling that one. That one, I try not to say anything's definitely not restorative, but a Supermax facility, not so much. But anyway, there are youth courts that are more or less restorative. There are community boards. There are all kinds of things that can be restorative or call themselves restorative when they aren't. I feel like conferencing models have the greatest chance of overlapping with those 6 factors. And I'll start with victim-offender dialogue, which is, if you like my low-budget pictures here, victim-offender dialogue is usually an in-prison program. It's after adjudication where it's usually in crimes of severe violence, and it's when somebody gets to sit down face-to-face with the person that harmed them or took their family members' lives and have an honest and open dialogue with the person who harmed them. So it's a very powerful model. You can learn about it through 2 films that I would strongly suggest seeing. One is called Meeting with a Killer, and that's the Texas model of victim-offender dialogue, and the other is Beyond Conviction, and that's the Pennsylvania model. And there's some differences between the 2, and they're very interesting distinctions. So if you're interested in that model, I would check out those 2 films. Next is family group conferencing, and this is something that came from New Zealand. The Maori people basically revolutionized the juvenile justice system to end incarceration nationwide in New Zealand, and I'll be talking more about that later, but the basics of it is bringing a young person together directly with the person that they harmed, and with their supporters on both sides, coming up with a plan by which the young person does right by the victim, by their own family, by the community of harm, and most importantly, in some ways, by themselves. And when that plan is completed, the case is basically expunged. And they do it with all crimes except for murder and manslaughter. And I'll talk more about that because that's the model I'm doing in Oakland. Oops, I forgot the other one, which is Peacemaking Circles, really important. can be used in all kinds of ways. In some ways, they can be restorative. In some ways, they can just be like talking circles and learning circles. And there are ways in which it's restoratively influenced, but they can be used in ways to directly resolve conflicts. And that is when I would think of them as more restorative justice. When I think about restorative practices that lead to justice, they're ones in which you're resolving some sense of a conflict there. And so, but you can use peacemaking circles in a wide variety of situations, and I think that they work best, like, say, in a school setting where you're using them for everything, talking circles, teaching circles, so youth aren't afraid to come into the circle when there is a conflict. It's not like you only have to go into circle when something's wrong. So in some ways it's good to set it up just generally, and then it's available for justice needs when necessary. So I'll tell you a little bit about Oakland Unified School District now. OUSD has many schools. It's a humongous school district. Over I think 101 schools in total. And Cole Middle School is a very interesting case of application of restorative justice. Really successful case of application of restorative justice. Rita Alford, who is a member of RJOY, she used to be. So Oakland Unified School District has a unified disciplinary hearing proceeding process for the entire district. So when kids are getting expelled, they actually get expelled sort of through the superintendents, through a subset of the superintendent's office. And what that looks like is they're getting expelled usually from the entire district in a way that's very distinct, separated out from the school and the place usually where the harm occurred. And Rita used to be what's called the DHP process. Rita used to be a DHP officer and then became a dean of Cole Middle School, which is basically like a vice principal of sorts. She took a training, I think she took a training with ROCA, with somebody from ROCA had come, which is here in Boston, came to Oakland and trained her, and then she did some subsequent other trainings in circle processes. Was so excited. She said, this is the way we need to be doing school discipline in Oakland. And went into Cole Middle School, which is, in West Oakland, incredibly high levels of poverty. One of the highest murder rates anywhere in Oakland is right around that school. It's had one of the highest teacher turnovers, one of the highest expulsion rates, and the highest suspension rate of any school in the entire district. And so she went in there and started her first year teaching staff and administration, particularly the principal, peacemaking circle methodology. They did all their meetings in circle. They did all of their conflict resolution amongst the higher levels of staff there in circle. And this was really effective, and people who were really against it in the beginning came to see the wisdom of doing things this way. By the end of the year, they took it to the students. They trained the students in peacemaking circle methodology. They call it circle. They don't say peacemaking circle. They say circles. They train students in circle and train students to be circle keepers. At the end of the first year of students being circle keepers and trained in being in circle, they had a 75% reduction in suspensions. I think that's my next thing. 0 physical fighting on campus. 0 referrals to the DHP process. 0 expulsions. And near 100% teacher retention. Only one teacher left. Only one teacher left, and that was because of they were going on for higher education. So this was a complete transformation. Sadly, the school had also been really low performing for many years, and performance was also starting to rise, but not fast enough for No Child Left Behind, and they closed Cole Middle School, which is totally devastating. But anyway, 20 other schools are now interested in doing this, so it wasn't a total loss, of course. And those students are going to other schools, and maybe it'll take off there as well. So, but why was it so successful? It was because it was ground-up culture change. We were involving the students and the administrators in not just starting at the district level and trying to get the superintendent to make the change. It was happening. It was culture change in a school. And I love this quote by Ms. Thomas, who was a teacher at Cole, who says, in the beginning I thought I didn't have time for restorative justice, and in the end I realized I didn't have time not to. And she had been one of the most crossed arm, I'm not coming to these meetings thing, and now she does trainings with me, which I think is so great. And she tells this story about how, she used to know, it's just like she said, this knot in her stomach would start when she'd see the elbow starting to fly in the back of the classroom, and she knew, okay, I'm going to have to, where am I in my teaching schedule, and am I going to have to take these kids down to the office, and am I going to have to call in an aide to babysit this class while I deal with this conflict? And she said now she'll see the tension starting to rise in the classroom, and somebody will run up to the front of the class and say, Ms. Thomas, we need a talking piece. And they will go to 4 or 5 students will go back. They'll grab somebody else neutral as their circle keeper. They'll go to the back of the classroom, They'll work it out amongst themselves. She gets to keep teaching, and then they come back and sit down, and she says, I don't even know what they were arguing about. Can you imagine? And so really effective, and she's a true believer, and so many, many other teachers and administrators now are. So much so that it's going district-wide. 28 principals have been trained. It's being expanded to 20 schools. Sadly, we don't have the funding to have a Rita Alfred in every school, and there's only one Rita Alfred. She's amazing. But that being said, it's going to happen. I think it's going to happen slowly but surely. And the really exciting thing is that at the district level, I was saying that disciplinary hearing proceeding process comes out of the out of the superintendent's office. It's a subset of the superintendent's office, and they have been coming to my juvenile justice task force meetings, which I'll tell you about in a second, and have gotten so jazzed about criminal applications of restorative justice that they're looking at the nexus between criminal crimes that occur on campus and whether or not we can be using family group conferencing as the method of dealing with the expulsion process at the district level. So they want to shift their entire, which it used to look like a cross between a parole hearing and a trial, and they want to see it be a family group conference instead. So this is really exciting stuff. Next is a little bit about Alameda County's juvenile justice system. So in late 2007, some RJOY members met with Gail Barriola, who was the presiding judge of Alameda County's juvenile justice system. Told her about restorative justice, in particular about the family group conferencing model from New Zealand, and she thought this was the greatest thing ever and said, how can I make this happen? How can I basically force this change? I don't want to put those words in her mouth, but that was from sort of her judicial hat. She was saying, how can I implement restorative justice? And we said, that's not how restorative justice works. You have to have buy-in from all the stakeholders in the process, and this is going to take a while, and we have to do this in a particular way. So she created a restorative justice task force where she basically invited every single stakeholder in the juvenile justice community, from youth-serving organizations and victim-serving organizations and district attorney, public defenders, probation, everybody, religious, faith-based community, everybody was at the table. This is this huge, unwieldy meeting. It went on for a year monthly, where new people would come in who'd never heard of restorative justice, and we have to go back to square one. And after about a year, we started to get into a groove, and everybody was instantly frustrated and said, what are we doing? We're just sitting here talking, and what are we going to do? And so we decided to have a strategic planning process. It was in 2 days. We did it with restorative methodology and came up with a 3-year plan to change Alameda County towards a fully restorative model from soup to nuts, from pre-adjudication through post-release, making restorative justice be the frontline way of dealing with youthful wrongdoing. And as Judge Barriola would say, we want to see restorative justice be the way we do business in Alameda County. So this was really exciting. Unfortunately, we have no funding to actually make this happen, but at least the buy-in is there and the idea to move this forward at some point is there. So it's a 3-year strategic plan, which does involve a fundraising committee trying to come up with funds to start to make this shift. As a part of that 3-year strategic plan, there are 4 pilots. The first one is what we call, instead of family group conferencing, we're calling it restorative group conferencing, and that's my baby. The next one is restitution circles. And just briefly, when young people commit crimes and they are ordered a statutory amount of restitution, many of them cannot pay, and many of their families can't pay. They complete all of their obligations, including they're finished with everything that they were supposed to do, the time they served, their probation supervision, and then the victim still hasn't gotten any money, and they can't let the kid go because he hasn't paid his money, and so he eventually ages out of the system. And which is, ridiculous that we're like supervising 18, 20, 21-year-old kids. And then at that point, jurisdiction ends. So then the victim never gets anything. But in those later teen years, a single dirty urine gets the kid back in the system, even though he's done, so it's a big problem. And so we're trying to create a restitution pilot project where victims come back together with the people who harm them, where they come up with a new plan by which there might be some alternative to the money. Victims often actually don't really they rarely only ask for money. They usually ask for less money than you would think, and they usually ask for apologies and answers to questions like, why'd you pick my house? Or, so these are the kinds of things that victims don't usually get out of the regular criminal justice system, and they're getting out of these restitution circles. So victims are really satisfied with this process. Then Vogue in the Hall, which is the Victim Offender Education Group, was something that started in San Quentin by a woman by Rochelle Edwards. It's with lifers there. It's an amazing program that basically builds sensitivity towards victim needs by lifers, and the recidivism rates of the guys who leave this program are really low. Now, it's kind of hard to measure because recidivism rates of lifers who are released are generally very low, but it seems to be a very effective program that really changes people's lives. And so we're bringing it to the kids in the hall. And then COSAs are circles of support and accountability, which is a model that was created in Canada to supervise sex offenders who were being released. And it's a model that basically involves wrapping around a person before they're released, and the time that they're most likely, particularly young people, to commit crimes is when they're coming right back into their communities, back into their schools. And so this is creating a circle around them that involves the people who are best at supporting them and best at holding them accountable. And where there's been a breakdown in the family structure, we bring in support into that circle, wrap around the young person, and follow them out. And eventually, when we get the youth at the right place, ideally bring in the victim of their crime if they're still around and interested, to again help build that sense of what was the harm that I caused on the human level. Really helps reduce recidivism. So a little bit about restorative group conferencing, which is my project. We changed the word, I think I just said this, to restorative instead of family, because not all kids have intact families, and we don't want to cherry pick our cases in Oakland to only select cases where kids have families or intact families or what we would consider traditional families. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same thing as the New Zealand family group conferencing model, which started with the Maori people's resistance to disproportionate minority contact. So Maori youth were being locked up at an unbelievable rate compared to white kids in the same country. And Maori people said, look, we want to do this the way we've always done this, which is resolve it inside our own community, bringing young people together with the people that they harmed, having the kid come up with a plan by which they do right. And when that is resolved, then the case basically goes away, and we don't need to incarcerate our youth. Well, it was so successful that it went nationwide. The pilot started in the mid-'80s, and you can see there's this precipitous drop in incarceration rates. And they took it took it nationwide. It's not just for Maori kids, it's for everybody. In '89, the Children, Young Persons, and Their Families Act was passed, and youth incarceration is basically obsolete. They've closed their juvenile detention facilities nationwide using this model. So Sonoma County has a program that was started by a woman, by Jessalyn Nash. She's not still there with that program, but she came and trained us. They replicated it. They do it in a post-charge context where the kid's been charged with a crime and sort of gotten involved in the system to some degree. She's doing it with felonies and misdemeanors, and now they were doing it with adults, but when she left, with crimes as serious as vehicular homicides. And the statistics coming out of that, which I'll get to a little bit later, are remarkable compared to our traditional system of justice. She trained us, and we changed it a little bit to make it pre-charge, because I think that when dealing with disproportionate minority contact, there's a way in which getting in contact with the system at all teaches kids that they're now in the system and that's who they are. And so we'd really like to move it back as far as possible. So it's not just saying this kid hasn't been convicted of a crime, it's saying this kid's never been charged with a crime. And we are doing it with the Hayward Police Department, the Oakland Police Department, and with now the District Attorney's Office is giving me cases that those police departments by law were not allowed to divert. They had to send it by the DA, and now the DA is holding off on charges and giving me cases that are felonies, and we only do serious cases. I think that one of the big problems and why restorative justice has gotten a bad rap in the past is that it's net widening. It picks up a lot of graffiti and small level property crimes, and there's two reasons why I think restorative justice has gotten a bad rap, particularly in communities of color. One is that it does this net widening, and number two is that diversion programs generally are offered to white youth and not youth of color. And so one of the things we are explicitly trying to do in Oakland is to have this be something where we're dealing with youth of color, which we've only actually worked with one Caucasian kid so far, and so we're not cherry picking. We have homeless kids, we have kids in all kinds of different scenarios. We have kids with ongoing abusive relationships in their families. We have kids with priors. A lot of programs won't deal with kids who have priors, so we're doing all of that. So the district attorney is now giving me arsons, youth dating violence, all kinds of serious assaults, burglaries, carjackings. We're getting it all. So everything. We're not doing rape. We promise them right now we are not doing rape, murder, and manslaughter. But it's my dream someday that we can continue to make the things that we don't do smaller and smaller. So I co-facilitate with Catholic Charities of the East Bay, and my hope is is to seed restorative practices in as many agencies and organizations as we can to create facilitators of these processes so that we can take this to scale. With pre-existing agencies and organizations that are already serving youth or victims or whoever wants to learn how to do this basically, because basically anybody can do this process. In training people to do it, I'd like to have ultimately the DA be able to call any number of organizations, or maybe call one central organization that can farm it out to many different organizations who will be able to do this and take this to scale. And just a little bit about what's been going on in these cases with Oakland. We've had people who initially were terrified to be in the room with each other, parents who believed that their kids were involved in warring gangs, who at the end of a conference, saying, I want to meet through a video conferencing screen, I want a screen between us, and in the end, after a few prep meetings, people actually meeting in a circle with no screen and hugging one another and exchanging phone numbers and saying, how can we help keep our kids out of trouble? We've had genuine apologies and genuine offers of forgiveness right there in the circle. These things, sometimes they happen after the fact, but sometimes it happens right there in the circle. We've had parents spontaneously realize that they were the problem and that they need parenting classes. And just watching, particularly grandmothers, the power that a grandmother has when she's actually given some space to speak, particularly when we're using the talking piece, and everyone is just waiting their turn, and the way people can hold forth in a way that can really make a kid get it and cry, and you can see that the kid gets what they've done. But it also feels really loved and supported to change their life. So this is really a powerful part of the process. See, I didn't say anything that's going to let you know who any of those people were, right? I have to be particularly careful in the juvenile context. So next I'm going to talk about another one of my favorite models that I did that's not necessarily a conferencing model, but something that in the law school context people should really know about. This is something in death penalty cases, defense-initiated victim outreach. Tammy Krause created this field. She had a Soros Fellowship, and then she got an Ashoka, and she just really took this thing nationally. I first came to know about, I had been interested in restorative justice. I didn't know it was restorative justice, but I was studying the Tibetan system of justice sort of in my spare time. And then at my first clerkship, I was working in Vermont for Judge Sessions, who some of you may know wrote that Fell opinion, which found the death penalty unconstitutional. He was overruled, the federal death penalty unconstitutional for some issue of evidence law, but he's also the chair of the United States Sentencing Commission, and he's very open-minded about what can be beneficial and in criminal trials in particular, having been one of the few judges in this country who was a public defender prior to becoming a judge. So there's not a federal judge, not very many of those, unfortunately. So Judge Sessions got a request from the defense team to hire a I think they were called defense-based victim liaison at the time, but now they're called defense-initiated victim outreach person, which is DEVO, which we like better. So he got a request for a DEVO person, and he granted it. And so Tammy Krause came on the case. It was a really, really heartbreaking case. It was an interstate pipe bombing where a young man had been involved in some sort of internet scam with somebody from, I believe, Michigan, and the man, to punish him for having sold him a bad CB radio, sent him a pipe bomb. And it killed him in front of his mother in their trailer, and she lost her leg as well. And she was on the fence, I believe, about the death penalty, probably leaning towards it. And there was a lot of push from Washington at that time for somewhat dubious reasons, I think, because the federal death row at that point was extremely black, and this was somebody who was white who had committed a crime, and I think that there was something going on with that, like let's get this guy on death row. And so there was a lot of push to have this case move forward as a capital case. And Vermont also doesn't have a death penalty, right? So it's a very awkward place to try to find a death-qualified jury. So it was just a very difficult case to be working on. And once Tammy Krause's work came on the scene, you just felt the entire thing shift. What the role of a defense-initiated victim outreach person is to be an informational liaison in capital cases. It kind of sounds crazy, but somebody who's hired by the defense team who isn't actually fully aligned with the defense team in some ways, is more of a neutral party, exists for the sole purpose of meeting the needs of the victim, the surviving victim's family members in these cases. And so you call them, you write to them, you call them, and you show up and you say, hey, I'm here from the guy who's accused of killing your child, and we want to know if there's anything we can do for you. And as you can imagine, a big part of that job is to just receive the rage and to shuttle information back and forth. And there are ways in which there's a lot more information than victims get and can get from the prosecution than we think they can. And a lot of defense attorneys are afraid of using this. They're afraid of giving too much information that then can be given to the DA, et cetera. But every attorney I've ever talked to who uses a Devo specialist has only good things to say about it. And there was a Devo specialist in the Massasoit trial for 9/11, and there's a law review article. I think I'm getting ahead of myself. But basically their purpose is to meet victims' judicial needs. Kelly Branham is now runs this program nationally out of the Nashville Federal Defender Program. I'd strongly suggest if you're interested in Devo in any way, even if you think you're going to be a death penalty lawyer someday who's going to use Devo, but you don't think you're going to be a Devo specialist yourself, I would consider doing this training. I know a ton of death penalty lawyers who use Devo today, and here's the law review article that I would suggest reading that explains the value better than I'm explaining now of a Devo specialist. So, next, restorative justice inside. I'm going to talk really briefly about this because it's not really a legal model in a sense. These are for programs for guys who have, and women, who have been, and children, who have committed crimes already and they've already been prosecuted, and most of them have already been adjudicated, and they're sort of in prison, they've been charged, they're in prison or jail. And one of the best ones I know is called the Resolve to Stop the Violence program. I would read Dreams from the Monster Factory if you want to know about what prison can look like or jail can look like done right. This program is spectacular in working with people on the inside. And one of the things that the Resolve to Stop the Violence program has is what's called the Survivor Restoration Program. And what this is this brings survivors of crime, usually violent crime, in to meet with these guys. The Resolve to Stop the Violence program is a program that Sunny Schwartz read a little bit about restorative justice. She's an attorney. She was working with Prisoners Legal Aid, I think. And yes, she was. And realized that something completely different needed to be happening, and thought, what would jail-based programming look like that was restoratively inspired, and created this amazing program where guys, basically she took a dorm and she put, this is kind of unimaginable, 60 guys labeled violent offenders in a dorm together, and it's tight quarters in there, and they have the lowest level of violence of any jail in California based on this programming. And the number one thing that they're doing is really building sensitivity towards victim needs, helping people take responsibility for their behavior in relationship to what their victim might have experienced, and learning what the person sitting next to you might have experienced in the same way. And so the violence level comes way down. There's a lot of other really positive results. I myself am really involved in these victim impact panels and survivor restoration panels. I myself am a survivor of child sexual abuse, and my own path involved forgiveness of my abuser. Now, I want to just make this big caveat here because people talk a lot about forgiveness and restorative justice, and I think that it's very important to divorce those two things in some ways. Restorative practices should never set out to achieve forgiveness. If it's victim-identified victims' needs as the centerpiece of restorative justice process, victims may or may not need forgiveness. That being said, there's nothing like a restorative process to help sort of build forgiveness, but we really can't come at it that way in a sense. In the same way with Devo, there's nothing like defense-initiated victim outreach that leads to a victim ultimately saying, surviving victim's family members saying, I don't want this guy to get the death penalty. But that can't be the purpose of doing it if you're really respecting victims' voices. That'll probably, not probably, that is likely to flow in some ways, and forgiveness particularly is likely to flow from restorative processes, but let's not try to push victims into forgiveness. Okay, so I give this talk in prison all the time with these groups of violent offenders about my own history of abuse and my path to forgiveness, and the guys inside came up with this idea that they wanted an ongoing peacemaking circle exploring forgiveness in their own lives. And so we did this 18-week project where I co-facilitated with an artist facilitator, and it was literally one of the most beautiful things I've ever done in my life. So circles inside with guys using restorative processes. And again, with the forgiveness circle, we didn't try to answer whether or not forgiveness is right or wrong, or how to make you forgive anybody. It was much more of an open-ended discussion, which led to some really beautiful results. And another thing that's happening, again, victim offender education group in San Quentin, where primarily I've been bringing in other survivors of sexual crime to meet with guys inside. And one of the most beautiful things that's been coming out of this is guys are starting to stand up. Lifers in particular will stand up and say, I killed somebody who reminded me of the person who raped me when I was 7 years old. And they want a study group around child sexual abuse. So we're thinking about how to create a sexual abuse circle inside San Quentin's lifer community, with the goal ultimately, an inside-out circle. We're bringing in survivors from the outside who didn't commit crimes, or maybe didn't commit crimes that they got caught for, and guys inside who committed crimes, which they did get caught for, and trying to create a dialogue around how do we use our trajectory of healing in a way that's more positive instead of some of the choices that have been made. And then with the ultimate, the guys have come up with this thing too, where they say, when we find out that somebody is in for pedophilia, we want to kill them. And so that's one of the largest causes of murder inside prison, right, is that guys kill people that they find out rape children. Well, why do we think that is? Many of those guys were themselves raped as a child, and so they're very interested in starting a dialogue with guys who were in for child sexual abuse. So this sounds really juicy to me, and I want to get involved with this, but obviously there's huge security issues involved, so we're going to see where we can take this slowly. And this, I just wanted to share this with you, is the Forgiveness Mantle that the guys made. Every 2 or 3 weeks, the artist facilitator I was working with would, Morzano Myers, would help the guys come up with a piece of art that related in some way to the subject we were covering. So if we're talking about, is forgiveness weak or strong? Is forgiveness weak or strong? Can you be a man and forgive? You know, and so then she'd bring in some weaving project where she'd talk about the roots of weaving in African cultures. Is often it's a male activity, and that weaving is actually something that involves a great deal of strength when you think about it. In the fabric of a community is things coming together in a way that makes things stronger when they're woven together. So then she sewed this whole thing together, and these guys, it's like 18 feet long and 5 feet tall. It's huge. And the last week, and sometimes a guard would come in and out of the room when we were meeting, and the guard came in, and one of the guys, we unfurled it, and one of the guys looked at the guard and said, can we do something with this? And the guard had really gotten into this group. He thought this group was great. And the guys stood up, and they wrapped it around the outsides of themselves, and they just kept wrapping it tighter and tighter, and they came into this little ball, and they just stood there in silence for like 5 minutes, and a couple of the guys started crying, and it was really just this beautiful healing thing. So now back to the nitty-gritty for a few minutes, which is, I want to talk a lot about effectiveness, because I think this is very important. I'll start with victim satisfaction, because that's one of my big interests. In the Sonoma model that they're using for family group conferencing, greater than 90% victim satisfaction. And I often think about our victims' rights movement in the United States and how upset they are with how they are treated in our regular system of justice. Our traditional system of justice really doesn't make space for victims, and where they do, I find it quite expeditious for prosecutorial reasons, right? I mean, you're going to include victims but say what you want them to say. You don't include victims that don't present well, blah, blah, blah. You give people the chance for victim impact statements in death penalty trials and now in lots of different contexts where often what they say has absolutely no impact on what happens. Juries do the opposite of what victims ask for, or there's not enough by law for it even to go to a death verdict, and now we've had this victim beg for something that they can't have. I find that quite disrespectful. In restorative processes, what victims are asking for is at the center of the process. Before I get to that, victim-identified victim needs, which I also think is a rather feminist model, much more so than, say, mandatory arrest policies in domestic violence cases or no-drop policies, where we're basically supplanting the batterer with the state now saying, I know what's best for you, and I'll tell you what you can and can't do, and I'm going to subpoena you and drag you into court, and then I'll prosecute you if you refuse to testify against this person that you've now reconciled with, because we know you shouldn't be reconciling with him. And I think there's a lot of complex issues around domestic violence, and there's some situations in which, of course, safety concerns would ask us to think very carefully about whether or not we want to bring people together. But in Nogales, Arizona, there's a very effective restorative justice program going on with domestic violence cases, and I'd suggest that you check it out if you have some interest in the nexus between domestic violence and restorative justice. Next, reduce post-traumatic stress disorder. Meeting face-to-face with a person that you harmed, particularly when it was a faceless person to you for a long time, like like you came into your house and your house was completely wrecked and you have no idea who it was and you're having perpetual fantasies about what it was like to have that person in your house. When you get to meet them, you stop having those nightmares. You stop having those fantasies about what it looked like. So, there's a recent study that came out that shows significantly reduced levels of post-traumatic stress disorder after participating in restorative processes. Did I skip something? Oh, I'm going the wrong way. There we go. Increased family and community involvement leads to effectiveness. When you have the grandma, the neighbor, the coach, the pastor in the circle holding you accountable, not just the DA, the judge, the police officer, probation officer who you actually are less likely to listen to, have real pushback against listening to. There's something really powerful about that. There's also something powerful about including community in the decision-making process, bringing the problem to the people for whom it is the greatest problem. The people who are living with this problem every day, being involved in the decision-making process. Very effective, very, very satisfying for the people involved. Competency development. We do such a bad job with programming. Our recidivism rates are through the roof, particularly with juveniles. So when we have a plan that puts the person who harmed on a more positive trajectory, we're doing something that really can be a much more effective system of justice. Which also leads to reduced recidivism, right? Sonoma County's model has a 10% recidivism rate. Let's compare that to Alameda County, my county. If you lock up kids at the Alameda County level for even a short period of time, 75% chance you're going to see them back in the hall. At the county, at the state level, at the Department of Juvenile Justice, formerly CYA, they changed the name because of all the horrific things that were going on with CYA, tried to clean up its image. It's the exact same thing, the Department of Juvenile Justice, which Books Not Bars of the Ella Baker Center is doing a great job of shutting that down. There's only about 1,000 kids left, but those kids cost $234,000 a year to the state of California. That's how much we pay to lock those kids up, only to have them back, and 91% of them won't be back. So really, really ineffective. And Sonoma, 10% recidivism rate. The Resolve to Stop the Violence program that I was telling you about, Sonny Schwartz's program in the jail, greater than 80% reduction in violent rearrests after 16 weeks of participation in this program. You're in this program 16 weeks, greater than 80% chance that you won't be rearrested for a violent offense. Reduced incarceration obviously flows from this. New Zealand has basically ended youth incarceration nationwide. I think we could do the same thing here. Potential to reduce disproportionate minority contact is huge. And I've been working with James Bell, who I know is your former Daynard fellow here. And I took this model to him. I said, what do I need to do to tweak it to make it really effective for DMC purposes? He said, nothing. He said, this is the answer right here. So he said, the point is to get it studied so you can get funding to keep doing it. And so that's what our marriage is about. It's really fun working with him. He's got such an amazing mind, and he brings so many creative thoughts to how we can find a way to take this to scale, centralizing disproportionate minority contact reduction into this restorative model. And finally, something we all need to be hearing about today, which is this is incredibly fiscally sound, people. So much cheaper. A recent study by the Jerry Lee Center at the University of Pennsylvania says that for every dollar you spend on restorative processes, you save $8 in the long run. RSVP, which is a jail-based program, the most expensive, money-intensive program that there could be, $4 for every dollar spent. So it would take me about 3 people to do 100 family group conferences in a year. 3 people to do 100. At the cost of $55 per youth going through our regular system of justice, that costs the county $5.5 million a year to do 100 kids, right? So if you gave me $300,000, I could have a very nice office for 3 people with benefits, et cetera, doing this process at the cost of $300,000. That would save $5.2 million in 1 year alone. And schools, average daily attendance is the way schools make money. The more you have suspension and expulsion, the less kids are in their seats, the less money the school is making, which leads to less resources in the school, which leads to poor things that we're offering the kids, and then the kids do worse in school, which makes them get kicked out more, which makes there be fewer kids in the seats, et cetera, et cetera. So we could be saving a ton of money by keeping kids in the seats through reducing suspension and expulsion. So now we get a little bit to what the title of this talk was about, which is what does restorative lawyering look like? Do we need lawyers in a restorative justice program? I think it depends on whether or not you're looking to supplement or supplant your present system of justice. And I think in the long run, even in the short, well, definitely in the short run, we're going to be supplementing, right? But in the long run, given actual innocence, cross-racial misidentification, innocence claims, et cetera. We're always going to need our regular criminal justice system. That's my belief. I know other people feel differently about that. I think there are a lot of purists who think that we could have restorative justice for everything, including innocence claims. I'm not entirely sure, but maybe I'm too much of a lawyer where I believe in our due process stuff and things of that nature when somebody says it wasn't me. But so I tend to be on the supplement, but supplement a lot. Or maybe even have it be the primary model with this criminal justice system operating on the margins where necessary. So given that it's going to be supplementing, at least in the short run, we have a lot of legal questions to be asking, like how do restorative justice programs interact with due process, with the right to counsel, with the Eighth Amendment? So where's the restorative process kicking in? Did the right to counsel already attach? What's the role of lawyers in the processes? What happens when victims ask for really crazy things, which they never do? But it raises interesting questions about if the state is kicking this thing to this community-based organization to resolve it. Is there an Eighth Amendment question? So then what's the relationship of restorative justice to state action, to the rule of law? And finally, there's not traditional sentencing in restorative processes, and victims' needs, when victim needs are central and they're defining what they need, what the defendant gets or agrees to is rarely proportional to what any other person would get. So do we care about things like proportionality, uniformity of sentencing? Is that important when we're dealing with this model? I think these are things that lawyers need to be thinking about. A little more on restorative lawyering, practical matters. So, for example, when I started, we couldn't get unredacted police reports, and we got, for juveniles, everything has to be sort of crossed out. All this stuff has to be crossed out, which if I don't know everything that's going on in these cases, I'm not putting these two people in a room together, right? So you needed somebody with a little savvy about how to create a standing order to get the judge to sign to allow everybody who's doing the restorative processes to get access to unredacted police reports, but not too many people, because you want to make sure that you're preserving youth's rights to privacy around this kind of stuff. So you also have to ask questions about what can be legally diverted. In California, we have these 707B offenses, which are like strikeable offenses, and it says that they're not divertible, but are there ways that we can sort of shimmy around that, and how do we define a crime, and how do we get the police to talk about a crime so it doesn't have to be a non-divertible offense? So there's all kinds of things that we can do to get things into that you need lawyers to be thinking about. And then in terms of interacting with the system generally, we need people who, since we're talking about interacting with the system, we need people who can speak the language. So, but ultimately, in an ideal community-based conflict resolution model, do we really need lawyers at all? And there's this guy by the name of Dominic Barter. I don't know how many of you know about his work, but he takes nonviolent communication methodologies and applies restorative principles to it. He works in the favelas in São Paulo, and he's created these spaces with the community. He's sort of facilitated their creation of these spaces, sort of a 20-block radius where nobody calls the cops under any circumstances. And in part because there's so many places in which the cops are complicit with the terrible things that are going on in these favelas. And they have on-call circle keepers. They're places at community centers where you sign up for, do you need lawyers? Do you need lawyers for anything under those circumstances? So I like to think about being like the death penalty lawyers who work to make themselves obsolete. And so I think that restorative lawyers are basically doing the same thing. Like, how can we just kind of shimmy our way on out of here and let communities figure out how to do it themselves? So finally, the title of this talk, which is, what does it mean for lawyers to be practicing in a liberatory way? And I was really influenced by Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed and Bell Hooks's readings of his readings. And she wrote this book called Teaching to Transgress. And in that book, there's a chapter called Theory as Liberatory Practice. And those words, liberatory practice, just jumped right out at me. I thought, that's what I want to be doing as a lawyer. And so in thinking about Freirean pedagogy, student self-actualization is really at the centerpiece of this thing. And I think it's a great parallel for restorative processes because stakeholder self-actualization or stakeholder actualization is at the center of restorative processes. In Freirean pedagogy, we think about students knowing what they need to know to learn and how to meet those needs. And in restorative justice, we think these stakeholders know what they need for justice and how to meet those needs. They know what they need. And I think this is sometimes hard for lawyers to take off our we know best hat. and every other professional that I work with. And that's one of the things that I think Carolyn Boyce-Watson is going to be covering tomorrow in the Community Roundtable about this role, this dance that we need to do between bringing in professionals where we're needed, but also stepping off and taking off that professional hat and bringing our human self into the circle when we don't really need to be wearing that heavy-handed hat. So that got me really excited about the idea of sort of a Freirean legal practice in a sense. I think that they're particularly liberatory in a way, too, for lawyers, for us, because I find that this profession was, while I enjoyed practicing law in many ways, and I wouldn't mind going back to it every once in a while, there are ways in which it caused me to sort of split off from, my survivor history or my defendants' rights politics, and I felt really sort of split in ways that didn't feel whole and didn't feel helpful. And circles really liberated me from this binariness, from this us, them, plaintiff, defendant, right, wrong, victor, vanquished, win, lose, which really, and the ego stuff that goes along with that as lawyers, I think, is really huge, to just to dispense with all of that and just to be present with healing and coming up with best outcomes for all the parties involved in a way that feels really natural and whole. Circles basically also liberate from the hierarchy. When we get rid of those labels, we kind of get rid of hierarchy at the same time. And everyone in that circle is bringing wisdom that's equally important. And it's usually grandma or the pastor or somebody else has way more that's important to say than me. And I actually, despite the fact that I've spoken this long, I'm pretty quiet in circle. I'm like one of the more quiet people in circle. Try to remember, give it back to the people who actually know something about this situation, the ones that raised this child, the ones that have been neighbors to this child. These are the people who are going to, the victim's brother who's going to say, you are not saying everything you need to say about how much this sucked for you. Like, these are the people that know how to solve the problem, not me. And so I would just encourage the question of what does a Freirean legal education look like? What does it look like to bring circles into our classrooms? I know some of you do teach in circle, and some of you do things like bring all types of things like meditation and whatever into circle that I also, when I do that, I teach that way too. And I think, again, it's really wonderful to see what can come out of that, where the wisdom is in the group of people that you're engaged with, instead of seeing it as me having all the information and trying to impart that, sort of depositing this banking model of education. So, my goal is for there to be lots of restorative justice institutes in every educational institution in this country. And I would start first with statistics, even though I think that they ultimately need to live in a law school, because I think that restorative justice is about justice, and it is about accountability, and it's about obligations and legal obligations, and I think that it needs to be sort of thought about from a legal perspective to that end, and also to make sure that all of this well-intentioned restorative justice stuff that pops up here and there isn't actually running amok of the Constitution and other things that we need to be really careful about. So I think that we need to have lawyers sort of holding restorative justice in some ways, but I think statistics are really important up front to make it justifiable that we have these things. Because we have to prove that it's reducing disproportionate minority contact. We have to prove more that the recidivism rates are going to be so much lower, et cetera, because nobody's funding this right now, and we need to get it funded to prove it, and we need somebody to study it to prove it. Luckily, the Henderson Center for Social Justice out of Berkeley is offering to study us for free, which is great, but I think we need to take it bigger than this. I also think that restorative justice institutes should include a lot of different other, I think that it's ultimately an interdisciplinary field, so we need to have psychology, criminology, sociology, religious studies, definitely. I like undergraduate legal studies being a part of this dialogue because much more than you folks know, offense, undergraduate legal studies people have this like really creative inquiry thing going on where they're not like, what do I need to know to pass the bar kind of thing going on. And so restorative justice, not so much helping you pass the bar and a lot of, maybe keeping you sane enough to pass the bar, but not necessarily helping you pass it. And so there's a way in which involving undergraduates who think about legal education in much more creative ways in some ways than law students. Social work, obviously, and philosophy, legal philosophers, too, need to be part of it. So this quote is for your school, who I know is very heavy on co-op in wonderful ways. I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, and I do and I understand. And this is the way to learn restorative justice, is to do, and the restorative justice training programs that are out there are really heavy on the do. You get a lot of practicing what it's going to look like when you're in that victim-offender dialogue, et cetera. So Eastern Mennonite University Summer Peace Building Institute, and you don't need to write this down because I'll get this PowerPoint to all of you who need it. I can get it all to you. Sorry, I should have said that at the beginning. And then Eastern Mennonite Summer Peace Building Institute. Howard Zare teaches at Eastern Mennonite University. He still offers his like sort of RJ 101 class. It's amazing. I would suggest it to everyone. Kay Pratis' circle training. Roka was trained, I believe, by Kay and by the lineage she learned from. And so you could do your circle training. They know they offer 4-day circle trainings here. I've never done one of the Roka ones, but I know they're affiliated with Kay, and Kay train them. And I've done Kay's trainings amazing, life-changing. In many ways, it should be the first thing that somebody does in restorative justice, so you get a feel for what it's like to be in the circle before you start thinking about sort of more legal applications. Then victim-offender dialogue with Lorraine Stutzman. Again, those two films, Beyond Conviction, Meeting with a Killer, give you a sense of what that looks like. The Devo training with Kelly Branham out of the Nashville Federal Defender, but she travels. She does 2 trainings a year nationally. And the Vogue training at Insight Prison Project in San Quentin. If you are going to be representing people who serve time, that training is an amazing way of learning what the experience is going to be for incarcerated people. It really teaches you the stakes of your work. It really makes you take your work seriously. So finally, here's a list of useful texts. And this last one, No Future Without Forgiveness, is a wonderful explanation of what restorative justice looks like in international post-conflict societies. That could be a whole other talk about restorative applications in post-conflict societies through tribunal-type situations, but no time today, obviously. And here's just some parting thoughts on justice. I think these 2 quotes really summarize best what restorative justice ultimately can achieve. That action alone is just, which does not harm either party to a dispute. It's Gandhi and Gandhiji, and justice is love correcting that which revolts against love, which is Dr. King. So I think that's it. Questions? Sorry, I talked way longer than I thought I would.
I do want to remind everyone that we have a really outstanding panel tomorrow that's going to pick up on many of the things that Sujatha talked about today and carry it further. We're going to have Carolyn Boyce-Watson, Judge Jay Blitzman, and John Kitty, who worked with Sujatha and is now in Vermont, and they've each kind of carved, and they work in different areas, and they've kind of carved out pieces of what Sujatha talked about today, and they're going to be having a roundtable where they carry these issues deeper and discuss these things. And they disagree on some of the issues, and so I think it's going to be very, very interesting, and that'll be in room 220. So, if people have questions now, though, for Sujatha. Yeah, Michelle?
Care and protection of children. Yeah, so restorative practices are definitely used. There's family group decision-making model that's used a lot in California as well. It's sort of restoratively inspired. I don't necessarily call that restorative justice until, I think of justice as like when the kid's actually been taken away from the parents when they shouldn't have been, and we're trying to figure out a remedy for a harm in a sense instead of collective decision-making processes. But circle processes and collective decision-making can happen in all kinds of arenas. And when in California, we're looking at melding our delinquency and dependency courts, and so that's going to really impact how we start to use circles in that context as well. And it can be extremely effective, again, for the same reasons that who knows best about what this kid needs and who knows what they can and can't do, and what's a safe space in which people can admit those things. And sometimes these circles are the safest place where people can do that. Yeah?
You get a lot of pushback from the prison industrial complex. The fact that they generate revenue, a lot of it. And so prisons are actually beneficial. So in terms of money-making enterprises, how do you, strategize against that? How do you kind of get to the lead?
Great question.
Money might actually be saving money.
Absolutely. That's a great point. And there is generally a lot of resistance from prison guard unions for any restorative processes, and they will always come to the table to say, you can't do that, and that's not safe. And they cry community safety issues. When we see recidivism stats, we see actually restorative processes are a million times safer. Well, not a million, but 90% safer, 80% safer. So yeah, we do get some pushback. I think that's why it's really handy to have people doing simultaneous litigation strategies. So when I'm thinking about like Books Not Bars are basically shutting down the DJJ and through litigation and community activism purposes, and then but then we still have to figure out what to do with these kids who are doing something wrong, right? So we can't. I mean, some would say, and I would read Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis. It's a teeny little book that really gives some background on why maybe we should just shut it down even without an alternative, and we might be doing that. We have a 90% recidivism rate. Maybe leaving these kids alone when they do terrible things might actually be more effective, is the question that she poses. It's challenging for most people. But so when there's simultaneous litigation strategies or things going on in California right now, right, where like 40,000 prisoners have to be released right away, those are primarily nonviolent offenders or lower level offenses. But as we continue to have to, either fiscally or legally, because of the types of prison overcrowding that we have in California, I represented a lifer once at our hearing, and I went to his prison in the middle of the state, built for 2,500 people, maximum legal capacity under emergency situations, 4,000. There were 7,000 men in there. 7,000 men in there. I mean, it was like nothing I'd ever seen. So that's illegal, and people are doing stuff about it. So what are we going to do with these people? So in some ways, the prison guards union, is, as we continue to have this crisis in California at a minimum, the prison guard union is just going to have to keep up with the fact that this just isn't going to work. Now, whether or not Schwarzenegger is going to ship everybody out of state or privatize or whatever, I'm not sure. But yes, the point is that we do have to answer that. And when fiscal concerns sort of trump other sort of moral concerns or an interest in efficacy, et cetera, I haven't really engaged with that yet. I'm starting small. I'm starting with juveniles. I'm starting in a place where people are comfortable. My personal interest is more with adults, but I decided to do it with kids because I feel like it's more palatable for people up front to try to give these chances to kids, even though it's actually tougher in many ways than the regular system of justice. So.
I have two very different questions. One, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about your work with parents. I was a prisoners' rights lawyer, but I also worked extensively as a parent activist in the Boston Public Schools. And any time I was getting most radical decisions, why are you spending any money on 8 police officers in the school system?
Mm-hmm.
Not just pushback from administrators or but parents, who consistently, would say, number one priority is safety in the schools, and these are, Black, Latino,
Yes.
Asian,
Yeah.
white. And the other is, the cases you talked about, or the examples you gave, dealt with interpersonal crime. And what about white-collar crime? What's a restorative justice model there?
Mm-hmm.
Have you thought about that?
Mm-hmm.
Or are we just otherwise also creating like a two-tiered system
Mm-hmm.
where, some folks are just out of the courts?
Mm-hmm. So,
Other, the court systems for corporations and other,
mm-hmm.
more powerful.
Mm-hmm. So I'll answer the second one first, which is I'm a true believer and I think we can do it for everything. And I've seen Rita Alford do it for all kinds of things where you think you couldn't have like 90 people in a circle to resolve some conflicts. And so it's an issue of making the time for it. I'm working with kids now. We don't have white-collar crime, but we do it. We're open to any crime that a kid could possibly commit. I think that it can be done in the adult context, and I think it could be done for anything. But the primary criteria for participation is not denying responsibility. The person who's charged with a crime has to not deny responsibility, and that's rarely the case with white-collar crimes, et cetera, so that would be a challenge in and of itself. So I see that as a challenge. On the other hand, when people come to know about this, nobody resists this in New Zealand, right? Everybody knows that it would be better to do this no matter what crime you committed. So defendant participation is the key in some ways. Because where victims don't want to participate, with their permission, we bring in surrogates. And victims rarely say, I've never actually had a victim say, and I've never heard of a victim saying, I don't want this kid to get restorative group conferencing at all, right? So, and then eventually, like with New Zealand, it's not an option anymore. Everybody just does this, and they literally just do this for everything. So, I do think that it's possible to do it. I think it would be extremely time intensive. But when you think about a complex litigation case like white-collar crime, those cases take years to prep and years to take to trial. So why not spend the time on a circle? Why not? I mean, I'm a true believer. So, and because I'm a true believer, I'm really good at convincing parents, which gets to your first question. But again, it's safer. It's better. I mean, Cole Middle School does not have physical fighting on campus anymore. So why not go with a model that works better? And when you can convince parents of that, I get a lot of parent pushback. My initial meeting with parents are like, I am not letting her be in the room on either side, because the parents of the kid who did something wrong, and then if they did it to another kid, both parents are resistant in the beginning. But when we assure them of safety and we spend enough time in prep, parents really do get on board. And it's also really important to build a culture where people understand this process so that their fear level goes down. So at Cole Middle School, for example, there were teacher and administrator-led parent circles all the time. So parents were invited to come in and be in the circle and see what circle felt like. And parents were involved in circles, and then they talk in their neighborhood about what it was like to be in a circle, and it just sort of spreads. So starting small and just making it really welcoming and allowing people to know about it and being really convincing. And look, let me tell you, we have much less violence after this than before it, so you don't need a police officer here anymore. So. It's time intensive. It's slow and it's time intensive up front. But I do ultimately think it saves more time and saves the expensive time of people who cost more at the higher levels when we're giving it back to communities to take care of it themselves.
I'm wondering what the most difficult part of the work that you do is and how you deal with it. Ways that you challenge it.
That's a great question. Personally, it's just heartbreaking sometimes, and how I deal with it is just being a human being. Like, if anybody in the circle starts crying, I let myself cry too. So, that's always really great to have the freedom to do that, where obviously I never got to do that in court. And so this is really great to be able to cry. And having circle keepers, having time for self-care, and I think this is a problem with this is something I just preach all the time about anything, especially doing capital work, domestic violence, working with children who are, victims of, sexually exploited minors, all of that. You need to do a lot of self-care. And so making the time for that self-care, this is just me personally speaking. But then I look around me and I see the same problem with everybody, because we always make all the other people who need help more important than ourselves, and then we sort of burn ourselves out. So I find that circle work and all restorative processes are much more, I get to bring my whole self to the circle, so there's less of this shut down and then, want to go blow off some steam elsewhere, but then having no time to do that. It's less, but it's still there. So legitimizing taking care of myself is hard. Funding is, on a practical level, is the greatest stumbling block. I am ready to take this thing to scale, and there is no money. And I believe California when they say there's no money, that's the bugger of it. And the thing about it is that, I say $55,000 per young person, right? But only if they're simultaneously downsizing their system to save the money. So there's this presently operating system, and then I'm bringing in this new thing, and so there's going to have to be double pay for the first maybe 6 months a year, and we don't have the money for that double pay right now. And it's not, and the judge is on board, and the presiding judge she stepped down, and there's a new judge now, but she's pretty much on board too, and the chief DA is on board for juvenile. He says he'll give me 14 felonies a week. He said give 14 felonies a week. Can you imagine? I mean, how great is that? And I don't have anybody to facilitate that. I can't do that. I can do about 40 of these a year, max, and it's justifying that low number of turnout, low number compared to what a public defender's annual caseload is way higher than that, right? So that sort of thing. Yeah.
Just two part questions. When you're talking about working with youth instead of relief for a lower area, did you have issues around when kids kind of didn't have enough to eat and kind of the ability to participate in these things? So kind of around spending issues, these things. And then the other question is, we were talking about how you use restorative justice and issues of relationship violence. How did that kind of play out when you have things like that type of asking for forgiveness as kind of part of the abuse cycle?
Yeah, great question. So the first question is always have food at every restorative process that you're involved in. Restorative justice is basically all about eating. And we always have lots and lots of food. Just in terms of the kids who come into the room are often really cranky and they're often jacked up on Coca-Cola. You want to have healthy food in all of your restorative processes. And that's just the immediate answer. And then on the larger question, we try to have in our circles some service providers that are there who can offer services to the youth as a part of their plan to look at some of the systemic issues. So as we unpack them, the plan itself needs to resource the kid to do that, but it's a question of, I spend a lot of time with community-based organizations that are youth serving in order to hook them up. So when somebody comes to the task force and says, and this is a frustration people have in restorative justice, where they say, I do restorative justice, I do gang tattoo removal, and you're like, okay, harms, needs, obligations, not feeling the connection, but don't ask them to leave because your kids might need some tattoos removed or not, but keep a list of all of those resources and say, I'm so interested in this and I want to do restorative justice and I remove tattoos. Great. Let me keep track of you. So I try to, Center for Family Counseling is now wanting to bring a family counselor. They provide free services. I want to have them in the circle every time. That was your first question. Your second question is, it's a longer question, it's a longer answer, but I would say people need to have multiple areas of expertise. So you need to be a restorative justice expert. You also need to be a domestic violence expert to do that kind of work. So when you're doing, so I would want many people involved in those restorative processes that know a lot about DV. So we're not like in the honeymoon phase and thinking everything's great and then everybody leaves and then there's some huge blow up right after that, right? You need to know what cycles of violence look like to be able to do restorative work in those kinds of. So we need specialists. We need restorative justice specialists. So Linda Mills is one of those specialists. The Center for Violence and Recovery out of NYU specifically tackles this issue. She studies the program in Nogales, Arizona. She wrote a book called Violent Partners. And if you're interested in restorative justice in relationship to domestic violence, I'd read that book.
I know several of you still have your hands up, but I will come tomorrow and can continue the discussion. And I want to thank Sujatha again.
Mm-hmm. Thank you guys. Thanks a lot.